Today we're going to talk about language change and the various processes that occur that allow new words to enter the English language. It is estimated that the English language has approximately 1 million words, if not more. It's difficult to identify an exact number because we have so many old words that have fallen out of usage, and we have many new words being created all the time. So it's difficult to get an idea of exactly how many words exist in the English language, but we're estimating about 1 million. It's also estimated that there is a new English word created every 90 minutes. So that means each day about 15 new words come into the English language. When we talk about new words, we have a fancy linguistic term for that called neologism, which simply means new word. While every day there are new words entering our language, each year the American Dialect Society gets together and votes on the neologism of the year, the new word of the year. Sometimes the word of the year is truly a completely new word in our language, but more often than not, it's an existing word that now has a new usage, meaning it has a new meaning. Additionally, the word of the year is typically something symbolic of that year. For example, in 2016, the word of the year was dumpster fire. The voting committee felt that this word was symbolic of 2016, which, if you recall, was a difficult political year in the US. But the voting committee also saw this word phrase as linguistically interesting. We not only have the words dumpster and fire, which as individual words mean something completely different than the word phrase dumpster fire, but we also have the trash can emoji followed by the fire emoji, which together these emojis communicate dumpster fire. I now want you to pause this video and watch a TED Talk by Curzan, where she talks about what makes a word real. And in this video, she describes what it's like being part of the American Dialect Society and voting on these words of the year. Ultimately, she questions the concept of dictionaries and whether they're prescriptive or descriptive. So she covers some of the topics we've already been discussing up to this point in the semester. So go ahead and access this video either through the PowerPoint or through the video embedded beneath the lecture in Canvas, and then return to this lecture. So you heard from Anne, any word is a real word if it's understood by a group of people and if this group of people understand the intended meaning of it. Not every new word is going to last very long, and not every word is going to make it into the dictionary because we know there's a lot of slang that is very short-lived. They don't stick around long, and yet other words do have staying power. But regardless of whether or not the word is around for decades or the word is around for 1 year, all words must be created somehow. So today we want to go through the different ways that we create words in English by specifically looking at each of these word formation processes below. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list. There are a few other ways that we may create words in the English language, but today I'm giving you the top most utilized formation processes. You might think whenever we need a new word, we just pull it out of thin air. We just put together random sounds and create something new. And sometimes that does happen. And this is a type of word formation process called invention. Some examples of words created like that include nylon, barf, zit, scam, and Google spelt with OL. A quick note about Google spelt with OL. This word would later influence the creation of the word Google spelt with LE. However, spelling Google with LE is not then considered an invented word. It falls within another category we're discussing today called false etymology. But Google spelt with an OL is indeed an invented word. Invented words are not very common. This is not the typical way we get new words in the language. Most words instead are just actually modifications or adaptations of already existing words. So let's discuss what that looks like. One example of this is compounding. You are probably familiar with this concept already. This is taking two words and putting them together. For example, high chair, workout, and football. Another process is going to be blending, which is similar to compounding in that it involves putting two words together, but it's different in that in compounding, you just place two words next to each other. In blending, you basically scrunch those two words together, and in doing so, some information is lost. Again, an example of compounding would be high chair. No information is lost in either word when you put those two words together. They are still two intact words. However, regarding blending, an example would be brunch, which is a combination of breakfast and lunch. And by blending those words together, we lose information on each word. We keep the BR of breakfast and the UNCH of lunch, but we lose, in this case, letters and sounds from each initial word. You can see several examples of the many blended words we have in English. I want to draw your attention to the last one on the screen. You have probably all heard the word chillax, and you may even know that this word is a blend from the words chill and relax. What's interesting about this word is that it was only recently added to the dictionary in October 2019. Here you have a word like chillax, which has been around since the 90s, and it's popular enough that I imagine everyone in this class has used this word and knows the meaning of this word, yet has only been recently added to the dictionary. I point that out because the last few weeks we've been talking about dictionaries and whether they are prescriptive or descriptive. This word obviously has been around for a long time. For most of you, it has been around your whole life, yet it was only just now added to the dictionary. But back to our topic on word formation, all in all, you can see we have a lot of blends in English and are likely using a lot of words that were created by blending without even knowing it's a blended word, without even knowing its etymology. I'm guessing the majority of you also had no idea that motel was a blend of motor and hotel. Okay, so we've talked about invented words, compound words, and blended words. Now let's quickly talk about clipping. Again, it's not a complicated concept. Clipping is simply when we cut off part of a word and make it shorter. Here's a list of some examples of clipped words in English. Dorm is a clipped version of dormitory, and flu is a clipped version of influenza. Here we have some more examples. The typical trend is to cut off the last part of the word, but then you see raccoon is clipped to coon, and we see that the first syllable is actually clipped off. Another thing about clipped words is that sometimes we've used the clipped version for so long that we don't even realize that the longer version exists. Another common way we get words is through acronyming, which I'm guessing is something you are probably very familiar with. What you probably haven't thought about is that there are two types of acronyming processes. By definition, an acronym is an abbreviation formed from the initial letters of other words and pronounced as a word. Think about the last part while I read these acronyms. NAFTA, SCUBA, NATO, NASA. They are all abbreviations and they are all pronounced as a word. We don't even say NAFTA, we say it as a word, NAFTA. We can call these word acronyms. Alternatively, we have something called spelling acronyms. There's an actual name for this called initialism. This is when we abbreviate a word but pronounce the initial letters separately, such as UNTD. AKA, FBI, and LOL. Like the other word formation processes, sometimes we get used to using a word and we forget its etymology. We forget where the word comes from. In acronyming, a great example of this is SCUBA, which stands for Self-Contained Underwater Breathing Apparatus. But we typically just say SCUBA now and forget that it's even an acronym. Another cool thing about acronyming and abbreviations is that there are some forms that are exclusive just to the written context. Think about these acronyms: LOL, TBA, BRB. Now, occasionally I hear people starting to say LOL, but for the most part, this acronym and the others are only used in written communication. We also have some abbreviations that only exist in writing, and we wouldn't use these abbreviated forms in oral communication, such as doctor, abbreviated as DR, or OCT, which we could pronounce as oct, but we don't. We also have MRS, which we pronounce as Mrs. One crazy thing about that word is that, believe it or not, it is actually an abbreviation for the word mistress. If you search mistress in the dictionary, there are actually two definitions for the word. And I'm guessing most of you only know of the word to mean its second definition, a woman having an extramarital sexual relationship, especially with a married man. Most of you are unfamiliar with the first definition, which is more of how we think of as a married woman in a respectful way. Back to acronyming in general, sometimes we have backronyming. This is when we take an existing word that is not an acronym, but people try to make a word out of it. Amber Alert is a good example of this. People have backronymed the word AMBER to stand for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. But this is not what AMBER means. The name Amber in Amber Alert is actually the name of a real child that went missing. And when a word is created from a person's name, we call that eponyming. Eponyming can be a person's name, but it can also be a person's title, an animal's name, or even the name of a place. A super obvious one is Adam's apple, which is taken from Adam and Eve in the Bible. We're using this name to reference the bump on a man's neck. Achilles' heel, which means is your weakness, and Achilles is a hero from Greek mythology. In the story, he was dipped in gold, which made him very strong. So when he was dipped by his heel. So his heel was not covered in gold, which made this his weakest point. Therefore, we get the saying Achilles' heel, which represents someone's weakness. Cesarean section, also known as a C-section, is a reference to Julius Caesar, who was the first documented person to be born by C-section. There are quite a few of these in the English language. We also have cases where we can use some of these in phrases, and these names connotate something about a personality, such as don't be a Scrooge. We know Scrooge is a negative person. Romeo is a lover, and Pollyanna is naive. These names present personality or character disposition, so we use them to denote these specific meanings. Sometimes we have other eponyms that are not super obvious, such as nachos. You guys read about this guy in week 9. Nachos were named after a guy named Ignacio, who went by the nickname Nacho, and the ever so popular snack of chips and cheese was named after him. Cardigan and sandwich are not from a person's name, but rather from a person's title. For example, Earl of Sandwich. Jumbo was the name of an elephant. Some are obvious, some are so far removed at this point, like sandwich, jumbo, and nachos, that we don't think of them as eponyms, but that's still their history. Sometimes we get new words because of false etymology. When we're looking at a word's etymology, we're looking at the history of the word. So a false etymology is when we're relying on bad information or have misunderstood the history of the word. For example, butt naked used to be buck naked, and the word buck used to mean something, but buck no longer holds the same meaning to us that it must have had once in our society. In our modern understanding, we can no longer sensibly relate buck to the phrase buck naked, and so it has made more sense to us over time to start saying butt naked, because we can reasonably relate the word butt to nakedness. So this is a great example of false etymology. It was either an intentional change done by speakers because buck didn't mean anything, or it was a mishearing and we thought we were hearing butt. Acorns are words that sound similar to the original word, but the speaker is using the wrong pronunciation just because they thought this is what the word was. For example, we have Alzheimer's disease, and some people say old-timers disease because they sound similar and they are not aware they are using the wrong word or words. We may also consider the word Google to have false etymology. There's a cool story here of when one of the inventors of the search engine Google went to buy the domain name google.com. He accidentally misspelled the word. He meant to buy GOOGOL.com, but instead mistakenly spelt it as GOOGLE. He misspelled the word because he had only ever heard the word before, and based on what he heard, Google, he assumed it ended with an LE instead of an OL. Anyways, even when it's a misheard word, when these words catch on and start being used, all of a sudden we have what we call a false etymology. So now let's talk about borrowing, which is a term we have thrown around a little bit this semester already. This is a major way that words enter our English language. Borrowing is a misnomer, right? Because when you borrow something, you give it back, but not in this case. Think of it more like stealing words, but we have adopted a lot of words from other languages, like the examples on this screen. Nice comes from French, guitar comes from Spanish, sushi, which we took from Japanese. Another common way we get new words is through affixation, which is combining words with a prefix or a suffix. So we can have the word do, and we can add the prefix re, and now we have redo. By adding prefixes and suffixes, we can create a ton of new words. The longest word in the English language is anti-disestablishmentarianism. The root word is establish, and this word is then surrounded by prefixes anti and dis, and suffixes ment, arian, and ism. So we get the word anti-disestablishmentarianism by adding all of those prefixes and suffixes to the root word establish. We have zero-affixation, which is when we make a new word by using the root word and we don't change anything, but we change the part of speech it can operate as. For example, friend was a noun, he is my friend, that we then made a verb. I'll friend him on Facebook. Green was an adjective, such as green grass, but now is a verb, green up your city. It's the exact same word and just using it in a different part of speech. We talked about this concept a little earlier in the lecture when we spoke about the word of the year, how some of those are in fact new words, but others are already existing words where the definition and the usage has just changed. In summary, here are all the word formation types we just covered in this lesson. And as I said at the beginning of this lecture, approximately 15 new words are created each day in the English language. During the time it took me to make this lecture for you, at least 2 new words were created in the English language. That concludes our lecture, though. Please contact me if you have any questions.